Oops, I did it to the cloud. Laura's going to be mad. Oh, well. Hi, everyone. Welcome to Fuck Wellness. I'm Mallory.
I'm McKenna.
And Laura is not with us. It always sounds like the third one's like dead.
I know. Don't say they're not with us.
She's no longer with us. No, I'm kidding. She's just not here today. But we have two lovely guests. We have Emily Harrison and Steph Black with us today. And we have a podcast that I'm like, honestly, maybe the most excited about because it's combining two things that I'm very interested in, our theme of religion and faith and abortion access and abortion. We'll be talking about other things like well-being and faith and stuff, but this was Emily's idea actually when we were talking about ideas for religion and faith. So I'm super excited to have you both on the podcast. Welcome.
Thank you so much.
Thanks for having me.
Of course. I thought that we could maybe just start with you both giving a little bit of background on yourselves. Emily, maybe we can start with you.
Yeah, I'm Emily Harrison, pronouns she, her, hers, living in Arlington, Virginia. I am a full-time digital strategist, specifically email fundraiser for progressive campaigns, but do a lot of things on the side, maybe too many things. Shameless plug, I have a newsletter called Making Lemonade. Please
10 out of 10, just like to say that.
Thank you. I'm a self-care coach. I have my Reiki 1 and Reiki 2, so I do some energy healing things. I'm a clinic escort at an abortion clinic in Falls Church, where I am also a doula. And there's probably like 3 other things that I am forgetting, but I like to stay busy. And yeah, I think that's it.
And see our episode with Emily a while back. We'll link it in the description, but it was great. It was all on self-care. And I feel like it really gave us a lot of context for the ways we were trying to talk about self-care. And then Emily came on and we're like, oh, that's actually what we mean. We mean what Emily is saying. So, Steph, you want to introduce yourself?
Yeah, so I'm Steph. I use she, her pronouns. I'm here in DC, battling a little bit of a cold. So apologies if I sound a little too congested. I've been in DC for 8 years now, 7 years, going into my 8th year. I was a women's studies major, so math is not my strong suit. And I am a writer. I have been published in places like Ms. Magazine, The Progressive, Vice, Bustle, lots of smaller Jewish publications like Alma and Lilith Magazine. And I also have a newsletter called the Repro Queen of DC. And you can find that at stephlackstrategies.blog, shameless plug. And I also do digital strategy during the day. So I do mostly social media and the flip side of that. So I'm doing lots of creating and drafting social media for small orgs. My passion is doing this for pro-choice orgs. I sit on the board, I'm the vice president of the Emma Goldman Clinic in Iowa City, Iowa, which is an independent abortion provider, feminist abortion provider, and have been in the repro space in so many capacities, also probably doing too much, and really like, this work lights my soul on fire, and getting to do it through a Jewish lens like fills my soul. So it's such cool work, and getting to talk about it is so fun. So thank you for giving me the chance to sort of talk and imbue wellness and abortion with Jewish wisdom today. I'm very excited for this.
I know you both are busy, so I just want to reiterate how grateful we are that you both made the time to be here. Yeah. So last week for our first episode of this month, we all kind of unpacked what we felt like the difference between religion and faith was. And I'm so curious to see what you both think, if you believe there are any differences between those two terms, and maybe can give us your own definitions of what those two terms mean to you. That would be, I think, a good place to kind of set some context for this conversation.
Yeah, I definitely have thoughts to jump in. I think there are things to unpack with both of those words. Judaism, I'm Jewish, very proudly Jewish, and I think there's a lot of ways that Judaism gets misconstrued. I would not consider Judaism a religion. I wouldn't consider it an ethnicity either. I consider Judaism a people a peopleness, a peoplehood. And there are religious aspects to that. There are cultural aspects. There are, of course, genetic and ethnic aspects to Judaism. But one doesn't need to be devout or what you would say, like what you would call faithful in order to be Jewish. And you don't need to be ethnically Jewish to be devoutly Jewish, or to be a Jew for that matter. And I'm always very sensitive to the idea that people can convert to Judaism, right? So they're bringing their ethnicities, they're bringing their genetics, they're bringing their background, they're bringing their own cultures into Judaism, which opens, our door even wider and makes our tent even bigger. And people convert to Judaism without being devout, without believing in God. I know a lot of Jewish atheists. One of my best friends is converting atheist, not religious in any way in that sense, but like one of the most devout Jews I've ever met, very dedicated to Torah study and is doing a halachic, a Jewish legal conversion. And I don't, and then there's somebody like me who I would consider myself to be Jewish and devout, and I do believe in a divine power. I don't know that God is the right way to describe that, but I wouldn't necessarily say that I adhere to Jewish law necessarily in my day-to-day life. It's something I aspire to, I think, but not something I feel strongly compelled to do. So I think there's, a lot of ways that the word like faith, I don't think quite applies to how Jews do Judaism and how we do Judaism and all the ways to do Judaism. So it's like such an interesting nuance when it comes to Judaism in particular.
That was so beautiful. I love the way that you talked about that and described that. Oh my gosh. Yeah, I think for me, faith equates to what I usually refer to as spirituality. And I define that very loosely, like it's anything that feeds or heals your soul, like it's your deepest self, it's what you know to be true, whether that's on the small scale or the grand scale. For some people that could be like nature, breath, energy in general, or like a more organized religion. I think I try to keep it vague on purpose because I think it's the most personal of the 4 quadrants of care that I kind of view both my life and general self-care or life practices to, those 4 quadrants being physical, mental, social, and spiritual. And I think whether I want it to be this way or not, when I think of or hear religion, I do think of a more structured and organized form of spirituality or faith. Like, I don't think it's necessarily what it has to be, but I think that's what it's become. And you can definitely have faith without religion, and you can have religion without faith, and you can have both, you can have neither. And for me, I think they are tied. I have a much broader faith than my religion that I follow and believe in prescribes, which I'm Catholic. I should have probably said that already. And so I think, yeah, they're very similar. They can be very similar, but they're also very different in the ways that I would say most people I know walk through their life with regards to faith and religion.
Yeah, I like that point of you can have one without the other. You can have both and you can have neither. Yeah, I like that.
That's a lot of what we talked about last week. And it was just so funny and interesting to sit down for the first time and distinguish between the two. And Emily, I very much had the same opinion of religion felt much more structured and strict in a way. And also the thing that seems to sway people in terms of, social decisions and, all of those things. And it's interesting because faith is so much broader to me as well. But then Mal and Laura were talking a little bit how faith, it does still feel kind of like you have faith in a higher power in a way. And that is just not really how I feel like I engage with the word faith. So it was I loved hearing both of your guys' opinions on kind of the differences and what you thought between the two.
Yeah, I agree. I feel like I've I described it last week as when I hear the word faith, I think of it in a very like almost in a Christian sense, like it's been co-opted by Christianity. And it's like, you know, you go into like a middle-aged white woman's house and it's like the love, faith, family poster. Like, I think whenever I hear the word faith, I think of that. And I think it's because I grew up pretty like very non-religious. And so the way my family would talk about faith was in, you know, not in a derogatory way, but in a way of like, this word isn't identified in our family. Like we're not a faithful family. And so then I immediately just associated that word with like a organized religion. But I think it's fascinating hearing like your perspectives on it too, because McKenna, Laura, and I all have had like various experiences with different, like, I don't know, spirituality, religion, whatever throughout our lives. But yeah, very interesting to get other perspectives on it. Go ahead.
Just to keep going, actually,
Yeah,
like
Steph.
the word faith in particular, that's not really a word we use in Judaism. There is a Hebrew word emunah, which means faith, like to have faith, but we don't invoke faith in Judaism. It's not the way that our religion is structured, really. Like, I think often faith, when that becomes really toxic, and a toxic tool is when you're told to just have faith, just like don't question, have faith. Whereas in Judaism, that's like the whole foundation of our religion. Is like the word Israel means God wrestler. Like we wrestle with angels, we wrestle with God, we wrestle with Torah, we wrestle with these questions. Questioning and searching for answers is a core foundation of Judaism that draws a lot of people. So when faith gets used, it's just sort of like, oh, just have faith, don't worry about it. So foreign to me as a concept. So most Jews wouldn't necessarily describe themselves as faithful. I think people would say they're devout or they're practicing, but faithful is not like necessarily the right framework for a lot of Jews.
That feels so powerful.
Yeah.
Sorry, Mal. It's
No, go
just
ahead.
because it feels as though there's a more of an active participation in your belief system and also your life and how you engage with others. Right. Yeah. That's beautiful. I think that I'd be interested to hear when we get kind of into the conversation later and when we're talking about abortion, but it also feels as though kind of like, I don't know, I think sometimes, and again, I'm not religious, so I don't, I always hesitate to like throw my opinion into the circle, but sometimes it does feel like in other religions, and I have felt this even without being, you know, practicing in any religion, of like judgment and things happening to you. And if you don't do this, then this is your consequence that you will have. And I do feel like it is kind of like demoralizing and scary, like especially if you were a child and you're saying here's the rule book, here's how to think, here's what to believe, this is what we believe as a family, this is what we value as a family, and there's no kind of like critical thought or you know, I don't know, pushback, not necessarily even to disagree, pushback, but to be like, hey, I'm curious about this, I want to know more about this.
Yeah, that is. And look, there's obviously pockets of Judaism where this isn't the case, but like I think for so many Jews, especially culturally Jewish people and Jews in North America, that is like a key component of being Jewish, is being able to search and find these answers and question things and poke holes in theories. There's like whole spiritual books that we read, like the Talmud and the Gemara, like the Mishnah, like it's all based on rabbis questioning the Torah and like finding holes in like answering their questions and going around and around. And there's far more disagreements without answers than there are agreements in our holy texts, right? Like it's never, and I think for me, that's what faith is, right? Like is being able to sort of hold the unknown and search for it and be able to poke holes in it and be able to say like, I'm not cool with that answer. Like, I'm going to keep going. I'm going to keep pushing. I'm going to keep fighting. And it's in those spaces where you find a lot of very feminist Judaism and you find feminist Jewish theology from saying like, actually, this doesn't sit right with me. How can I take agency to reclaim this and to rework this and to rethink this and to let some of these things go? And I think that's the Judaism that feels so hard in some ways, because like I actually in some ways envy my very Christian friends who can just have faith that there is a God and that there's an afterlife and that they just have to like check some boxes. And, you know, it's hard to check those boxes, but like, and then, you know, they had a sweet afterlife. You know, I don't have that. I don't believe in an afterlife. Actually, I don't believe in heaven. I don't believe in a you know, Christian system in which like you do good deeds and you get something in return later. You know, so it's, in some ways I'm actually envious. I sort of wish I had a framework like that where I could so believe that there was real purpose and meaning in life, you know, beyond just the meaning we create for ourselves. So it's definitely like a funky, it's in some ways like it's hard to not be able to tap into faith like that too.
It's so funny
Go
you say
ahead,
that.
Emily.
It's funny you say that. I'm thinking about my partner who was raised Catholic, but not really, you know, like just Catholic on paper, and is an atheist. And the few times a year where I kind of like drag them to come to mass with me, the whole time they're like trying to peek around and see, like when we're kneeling or, you know, sitting, like peeking around and trying to see what's happening up front. And they're so like, I just want to know what's happening. I just don't get it. Like they just want to absorb so much information about the faith. And that's just something that like you kind like what was mentioned, like Christianity doesn't really lean into. Like we don't really answer the questions. Like you kind of avoid the questions, especially like with such an institution of like the Roman Catholic Church. Like you have the catechist, you have the catechism, just go read that and that's everything you need to know. And it's so like unabsorbable. So like they're literally just like one of the worst rule books in the world. So yeah, that's just really interesting to hear that about the questioning of faith and all the, you know, religious texts and spiritual texts related to just questioning. Did you say questioning the Torah? That's so, I think that's so interesting. I think it's so beautiful. And I think if there were more aspects of Christianity or Catholicism or, you know, whatever that included that, it would be so much more open, inclusive, welcoming, like just it would pull more people in my opinion.
Yeah. You know, in Judaism, we don't proselytize. We don't ask people to become Jewish. And when people do convert to Judaism, it's a very hard process. It's very involved. It you know, requires classes and rabbis. And I'm a mikveh guide, which means a mikveh is a Jewish ritual bath. Been reclaimed. I did a lot of studying of mikveh, and I'm a mikveh educator. And I walk people through this process. And one of the traditional reasons for immersion is for conversion. And I hear a lot of people who convert from Christianity, one of the reasons why they're so drawn to Judaism in the first place is because it was the first chance they ever got to like ask really hard-hitting questions about these like very foundations of our faith, you know, about Genesis, right? Like about the core, like the very first texts that, you know, it's our whole religious text, but for Christians, it's like the first religious text, right? Like the Old Testament. And I always feel a lot of sympathy and for people who don't get that opportunity to really question things and question the status quo, because the deepest meaning I have found have been with the texts and the principles and the concepts that I struggle the most with. And that doesn't mean that I then adopt those faiths or practices or whatever, right? But it means that like I've given them so much thought and good faith questioning. See what I did there? And I get to sort of decide on my own 2 feet, you know, what resonates with me and what doesn't. And I wish that upon, you know, any Christian, right, who's in one of those loops of like, I want to ask these questions. I don't want to just be told to go read whatever and like just have faith, right? Like I want to be able to think critically about these things. So yeah.
Steph, you brought up a really interesting like comment earlier about how like sometimes you wish that like kind of, you know, sarcastically, but I'm sure somewhat seriously, that there was, you know, a more clear, you know, this is what happens, etc. And I think that ties kind of into the concept of how I know you said Judaism isn't a religion. I don't know how a people, however you want me to describe it, but how that has impacted your well-being. And I'm curious too, Emily, with, you know, your experience with Catholicism, like in what ways has your experience with Judaism and Catholicism like really benefited you and felt like it improved your well-being? And in what ways maybe has it challenged you, or maybe had periods where you didn't feel like it was benefiting your well-being?
Yeah.
I feel like Emily's ready for this one.
Yes, I was taking like some brief notes, just thinking of top, like, you know, ideas around this topic. And this is the section where I was like, oh, I've just written an essay at this point. I will not just read my essay that I wrote to you all. But like I mentioned, I believe in this 4 quadrants of self-care. So spirituality is like a huge aspect of my life and my self-care practices. I've always been drawn to Catholicism. My family actually left the church when I was in like late elementary, early middle school, for Lutheranism, which is like a much bigger religion in Minnesota than it is like on the East Coast, which threw me off when I moved out here. But anyway, like left this church, started going to this Lutheran church. And I actually brought my family back to the Catholic church when I was in high school. It just felt like it was the right move for me. And they were like, okay, we don't really care that much. If you want to go to this Catholic church, we'll go. And I'm the only member of my family who like regularly attends mass. Not that that makes me like more religious or more spiritual or, you know, in any way. But I have just always been more called to it very, very personally. It's not something I was necessarily raised in. I wouldn't identify as a cradle Catholic. I didn't go to church every Sunday growing up. Like we didn't really do anything with the church. It was just kind of something that was there. And like when I would stay with my grandparents for a weekend, they would bring me to their church. But it's always just meant a lot to me. I really feel at peace in religious settings. I try to go to whatever like Catholic retreats or workshops that I can find that I agree with, which isn't that common, but you know, when it's there, it's there. I read a daily devotional every single morning. For a good chunk of high school, I secretly wanted to become a nun. Like I was really thought that was like my life path. And it came up recently with my partner and I told them that, and they were like, please don't do that. And be like, it's mostly gone now, but you know, it sounds interesting. Yeah, I like care for myself spiritually through church, gospel music, meditation, nature walks. Like the weeks where I'm able to do all 4 of those things are just like most satisfying, like peaceful weeks of, you know, my life. Even when like these other quadrants are kind of depleted, like if I'm doing those things and really leaning into that spirituality, it just really fills my cup, gives me energy, it fills me with love, fills me with joy. And I feel like I go to the young adult mass at my parish. It's Sunday nights at 6. And like that kicks off my week in such a good way for me. But yeah, I wasn't always this way. Like most of the tension or feeling of not belonging, like was because of politics or social issues or just general beliefs of how to live life. I mean, I at this point fully refuse to go to my home parish in Minnesota that I was raised in, that I brought my family back to. It's just so harmful at this point for me to go there and be surrounded by so many people who view, in my opinion, who view the world and view others as less than, or you know, just don't prioritize what I would view as like the teachings of Christ, but claim that they are very religious or very spiritual. I was very involved with the Newman Center, the Catholic Center at GW when I was there for undergrad, and I ultimately left after a very heated conversation about birth control. I was going to mass 4 times a week my freshman year of college, and by my senior year of college, I didn't know anyone there. And so it's just kind of always been this cycle in my spiritual life of finding a place, it working for a little bit, hitting this political wall, and then leaving. And I feel very grateful that these past 4 years I've been in Arlington, I found a parish that aligned with me politically. And I have never had a point where I've been like, oh my God, here we go again. Like, it's just become such a spiritual home for me. And I think that's why I now have such a strong spiritual practice and such a spiritual self-care practice, because I found this community, I found this spiritual home. It aligns with me 98% of the time, and that is enough for me right now. And that is really what is filling my cup, is having that local community.
Wow. Yeah. Sorry, I was so absorbed in that. Remind me what the questions were.
I know. That was great, Emily. The question was, what are times that your experience with Judaism has benefited you and improved your well-being? And what are some times that you felt challenged, or maybe it wasn't benefiting you so much?
Yeah. Let me talk about the bad stuff first, and then I'll end on a high note. I think Judaism is a patriarchal religion, right? Like, I think there's no way around that. And I think that does rear its ugly head in ways that challenge me. And I think there's a lot of ways that feminist Jews and Jewish feminists have really, like, I'm standing on the shoulder of giants like Jill Hammer and Judith Plasko and so on and so forth. Like, there's really incredible work out there that of women who have really dived deep into just how problematic parts of our religious texts are, while also pointing out the ways that the people uphold that, right? Without the people, there would be no Judaism. So it's also our responsibility as Jewish people to do the work of unpacking the problems with Judaism, I think. And that's not just sexism. I think it's all of the isms and phobias that any group can perpetuate. Jews are not immune to that. It's hard, and I feel this way generally. Like, sometimes I feel too queer for certain spaces, too Jewish for certain spaces, too feminist for certain spaces. And there are times when I show up in Jewish spaces and I feel like I'm too gay, I'm too liberal. I'm not even liberal, I'm much further left than liberal, right? Like, so it can be really hard to find spaces that feel affirming. And when you do, it's like lightning strikes and you've hit a gold mine, right? Like, it just feels so perfectly aligned to get a space where, I get to be in community with people who are feminists and pluralistic. I'm not saying there's even like one right way to do Judaism, but people who value pluralism, who value, feminism, and are accepting of, a radical queerness and applying that to a Jewish space. It's rare, but when you find them, it's so good. It just feels so good. And I think one of the best, I always joke that Jews did self-care first, because the way that Shabbat is set up is the holiest holiday that we get 52 times a year. It's our most important holiday. We basically, from sundown on Friday nights to sundown Saturday nights, have a day of rest. And this rest looks very different from people. Some people don't keep Shabbat at all. Some people keep it so strictly, so stringently. Every community has their own definition of what halakha is, or Jewish law, and how they ascribe to halakha. But at its core, Shabbat is meant to reflect the world we want to see. So we're building this world where we don't spend money. So I think Shabbat is very anti-capitalist in a lot of ways. Shabbat is a day we don't work, right? So we're giving our bodies and our minds permission to rest. We're required to rest, right? We see friends and family, we forge these connections and we deepen these connections with our loved ones. And we really get to just be the version of ourselves we wish we could be all the time. And that's sort of the bitter part about Shabbat, right? Is that Shabbat ends. And we have to go back to this reality where, like, our noses are to the grindstone. We have to grapple with racism and white supremacy and sexism and misogyny and violence and capitalism. Gosh, like, there's a lot of things, and those things don't end on Shabbat. Like, let me also make that very clear. There's not this magical moment, these 25 hours where, like, sexism ends, right? But
a reprieve.
right, finally, like 25 hours, right? I
Men said, you guys deserve a minute.
right, like I'll back up for a moment. It's Shabbos. But I love the idea, like we're not supposed to spend money on Shabbat. So I love being like, maybe we're a little more anti-capitalist than we thought we were. So I think there's that is one of the ways in which Judaism gives us such a strong framework of, we are whole people. We are human, right? Like we deserve rest. We deserve time to not work, to not, dedicate ourselves to our livelihoods for a hot sec. So that I think is the biggest one. And I could talk about mikvah too, but I can also talk for a very long time about mikvah. So I'll table that one for now.
I feel like that is such a beautiful, like compassionate view on the human experience. And so I think that's really lovely. And I just want to recognize what you both shared was so powerful. Like I felt it's just so refreshing to hear a conversation that is not necessarily centered in like what I would center maybe a religious conversation in, and where there is joy and there is, celebration and there is rest and there's community. And it reminded me of this story. And I just want to quickly share because so when I was a freshman in college, I lived in Idaho, and this is a whole other conversation, but a lot of Mormons were in the area. And this girl who lived on my floor, she had converted when she was a teenager, which is also an interesting story, like her family was not involved at all in the church, and she converted, and she had a boyfriend who she knew she was moving to BYU eventually and was going to marry him. And I just remember like absolutely picking this girl's brain about everything about, I would be like, okay, so what about birth control? And I remember her kind of being like, like if other people want to do it, that's fine, but like it's a sin. And I remember her talking about, asking about abortion and asking, about all these different identities and questions, and her kind of always giving me the same answer, which was like, if you want to do that, that's fine, but I believe it's a sin and you will go to hell, or whatever their, definition of that would be. And from that moment, when I was exposed to Mormonism, I became fascinated in it. And whenever a missionary would knock on my door a few years later, this one particular situation happened. These two young kids, obviously, and I opened the door and they're trying to convert me, obviously. And I told them straight up, I was like, I will not convert. However, I do have questions for you. And so I asked them questions for probably 20, 30 minutes. And one of the questions I asked was like, what is your your favorite part about your religion? And it's just so interesting that the answers that they gave me were purely about family and community. And it's so hard and heartbreaking to kind of see these young people who really are getting something they value out of this community. And yet it is at the expense of not being able to explore so many different parts of themselves or allow love in from other people who might have different identities that are not acceptable within their religion. And so I don't know, that just both of your stories kind of reminded me and grounded me in the kind of the reality of, I think at our core, humans want connection.
And that's something that I probably value the most about Judaism, is how communal it is. I think, Judaism is also an ethnicity, right? You can see Ashkenazi on your 23andMe report, right? But just having Jewish blood doesn't make you Jewish. And I think that's where the peoplehood and the religious part comes in, right? Like you need, for the most part, I believe you need a communal buy-in to be a part of this community, and not just anyone can be Jewish. There's Midrash, which is like rabbinic fan fiction from back in the day, like that rabbis wrote to answer questions about, holes in the Torah, essentially. And one of them is that the souls, when we received the covenant at Mount Sinai, when Moses received like the 10 commandments from God, pregnant women's bellies became clear because God was not, and you could like see, which I have thoughts about as an abortion activist in my own right, but basically God was not only making the covenant to the people of, to the Jewish people who were there, but to the future generations that they would also be a part of the covenant. And the Midrash says that the souls of all future Jewish converts were there as well. And if you're meant to be Jewish, you're meant to be Jewish, but not everyone is meant to be Jewish. So this idea that there's this, and especially now as like anti-Semitism is rising, this idea that there's this really powerful communal collective feels so special to me and something I don't take for granted, because not every, I grew up very secular as well. Like I come from an interfaith family and found Judaism on my own in college and have really taught myself mostly everything I know with some exception. So, my fiance and I are actually technically legally married. And I have a lot of feelings about legal marriage and the institution itself and its really racist history post slavery and during the Reconstruction era, and as a tool, right, to control and populate Black populations and freed enslaved people. And so I never wanted to get legally married, but we made a deal that if Amy Coney Barrett was nominated and there was like ever a threat to marriage equality, we would just go get married. Like we would just do the thing, whatever, just for our legal protection. We wanted to have the rights and access it if we needed it. Roe fell, we were married by Monday morning. And I don't actually feel married. I don't feel like, I don't believe that the government gives us rights. I believe that we give ourselves rights. And I won't feel married until we have a Jewish wedding ceremony, right? Until we can stand up in front of our family and our community and our loved ones and be acknowledged also to the eyes of God, which is a little cheesy perhaps, but to have God recognize our marriage and to have our families and our loved ones, our people hold space for us. So I think there's like, that is such a source of wellness for me, right? It's to be able to sing in community and to be in community and to have people be invested in us and our relationship and us as individuals. So it's not the only way in which one can feel community is through a religious experience or a spiritual experience, but for me that is a particularly strong one.
Should we talk about abortion?
Always. That's what I do best.
I was hoping that maybe we could start with a very basic question, which is, what, from your interpretations, does Judaism and Catholicism say about abortion, if anything? Just because I feel like I don't know where our listeners are coming to this conversation from, so I feel like maybe that would be a good place to start.
Yeah, I can jump in on this one. Obviously it depends on who you ask.
Yeah.
Judaism is not a monolith. I think that's one of the beauties of Judaism and one of the many frustrations I have with Judaism, that apparently people are allowed to have their own opinions. And that includes abortion. I know. I will say overwhelmingly though, Jews are pro-choice. That is a given, I think, and in any Jewish community, even the most strictly Orthodox Hasidic communities, you will find people who absolutely believe that abortions are sometimes necessary to save the life of the pregnant person. This concept harkens really to what is called pikuach nefesh, which is the saving of a life. We are almost above anything else commanded to protect life, and life is pretty clearly defined as first breath. Adam wasn't alive until God breathed life into him, until Adam took his first breath. And so when the life of the pregnant person is at risk and an abortion is required to save the pregnant person's life, it is not only like allowed, it's required, which I think is a pretty radical shift from how we think of religion and abortion. But the life of the human, of the actual person who has lived a life and has probably other children, right, trumps that of a fetus. And that is echoed in multiple places throughout the Torah. I'm going to butcher this, I'm sure. There's going to be Jewish people who are going to absolutely correct me, as they should. But a man pushes a woman, causes her to have a miscarriage. He owes her compensation for physical harm, but not murder, which clearly shows that what happened was a tragedy, and sad. This potential, maybe future child, but not the death of a child, not the death of a baby, which sometimes feels a little cold to me, and actually can present a problem when Jews are trying to mourn miscarriages. There's not halachic or legal or prescribed ways to mourn a miscarriage, because technically speaking, we don't view fetuses as people, right? That has changed a lot. There's some really beautiful liturgy and prayers that have been written in ceremonies and rituals to do now to mourn miscarriages and to hold space in that way. But even in the strictest sense, every rabbi will say, if your life is in danger, maybe not every, but I'm gonna say every rabbi worth their salt will make an exception for an abortion for someone who absolutely needs one. And in the most liberal places, you have rabbis who are, I helped launch the National Council of Jewish Women's Rabbis for Repro campaign. We have almost 2,000 rabbis now who have signed up to be like beacons of reproductive hope and pro-abortion and pro-choice. So you get that other end of the spectrum too.
On the extreme opposite end of that, you can find Catholicism, which is in theory a monolith. Everyone is supposed to believe the same thing. Every mass is structured the exact same way, with the same readings and the same structure, the same prayers. And it is in the institutional church believes that life begins at conception. So abortion is murder, abortion is against the church. The church didn't adopt this as a rule until like the mid 1800s. So it's not like even a basis or a cornerstone of the faith. I mean, Saint Bridget, like one of her miracles to make her a saint was essentially an abortion. It was making a pregnant woman no longer pregnant. So, I mean, there are groups like Catholics for Choice. I'm on the personnel and hiring committees for a progressive Catholic nonprofit called Call to Action, and we most recently, or pretty recently, published, a very pro-abortion statement. And so there are those chunks. I mean, I think the stats are that like a majority of Catholics are pro-choice. A large chunk of patients who get abortions are Catholic. So it's one of those things where it's like the church, it is wrong automatically. But like, I have a little bit of hope that maybe in like 1,000 years they won't say that anymore. I don't know. I feel like if we just keep pushing, maybe it'll change.
And like, can we just dive right into that? Maybe like, how do you navigate that as a Catholic, but also as a very pro-choice person? Like, how have you kind of gone through that journey with Catholicism?
Yeah, I definitely was not always pro-choice. On a mission trip I went to in high school, it took me until like literally 2 years to figure this out for like my brain to connect the dots. But a mission trip to Denver I went on in high school, one of the days was fully devoted to working at a fake clinic and like lying to people and handing out like, one of the worst parts that like I remembered as like being a cool, like a fun thing in high school, and now I'm like, oh my God, that's so manipulative and like evil, was finding the cutest baby clothes that had been donated to the clinic and making sure that they were front and center when people were coming in, and making sure like, oh my God, look at this little sailor suit. Like, wouldn't your baby look so cute in that? And like, so that's really where I was at. It took until entering college. There was a lot of things going on. I mean, moving out of the most conservative area of Minnesota to Washington, D.C., being on Tumblr, like that really like, I don't know, like started my feminist awakening. And finally being in a situation where I realized I could be getting pregnant. Like I was having sex, I could get pregnant, I couldn't get an abortion. And all those things kind of happening in like the same year really started throwing me into like identifying as pro-choice. And this awakening was happening at the exact same time. Like I said earlier, I was going to mass 4 times a week. So this freshman year of college was very tumultuous, a lot of tension internally. And it's hard to balance. It was really hard to balance then. And it's ultimately why I stepped away from the church for like 3 years, because I just couldn't handle it. It didn't seem worth it. It didn't seem like I had the energy to go about it. But once I came to Arlington, I started going to this church that I mentioned, Our Lady Queen of Peace. And no one ever brought up abortion. Like we just don't bring it up because we all kind of like, we all feel the same way about it, but the priest can't technically be pro-abortion. So like, we just don't say anything. And like, that was really when I started to grow in both my abortion rights activism and then also this like very strong like cornerstone of spirituality that I feel like I have now. I do believe that like my God loves abortion. Like if Jesus were to come down today, he would love abortion. Like I just very much believe that to my core. But sometimes it does kind of hit of like, the church is never going to back me up on that. It's so hard to have those conversations. I've tried and joined so many Bible studies in this area, like literally every 3 months. I'm like, I just want a community of like Catholic women to connect with. Like, I just want friends who I can go to church with. And I have left every single one within 3 or 4 meetings because it's like, oh my God, it's not worth it to keep going into this. And why is it so hard to find young people who like believe and practice this faith and also are, pro-abortion, or I'll even take pro-choice. I'll take a pro-choicer who says like, I don't like abortion, but I'm pro-choice. Like whatever, I would take anything at this point. And it's so hard to find and it's so hard to balance. And sometimes I do feel that like really the core, like anti-choice beliefs that I was raised on. The first time I was in a room during an abortion procedure as a doula, that shook me to my core, not in a bad way, not in the good way. It was just such an experience that for 18 years of my life, I was so against. And seeing it actually happen, I was like, this is a really big moment for me. This is a very big like crossroads of my life. And it didn't feel like crossroads at the time. But I was like, I actually do still believe in this work and I'm going to dive into it more and keep doing this doula work as much as I can, while going to church, while like handing out backpacks to the kids. Like I just became a Sunday school teacher, like trying to balance it as best I can. But I know the moment that I leave this area and I don't have this church anymore, I will probably lose that community again. I will probably lose that big cornerstone of faith I have right now. And I'm going to have to choose again, do I want to be this like abortion activist or do I want to be a practicing Catholic?
Oh,
It's a bummer.
That's heavy. And my words are not at the tip of my tongue, but I think that it is so brave to, I think, even confront that choice and to be willing to sit with kind of that knowledge that you have and continue to kind of push back in both areas in a way. Like that takes a tremendous amount of effort, personally and internally. And so I think that's, very commendable of you.
Thank you. I really appreciate that affirmation because sometimes it's definitely like my partner and I have been talking about moving to Minnesota and we think that in January we're going to move back. And I've already started the research of like, please just let me find somewhere, something. Like I love the organizations that do exist. I love Catholics for Choice. I love the, nonprofit I'm involved with. But it's just not the same. It's not the same. That feelings and joy and cup filling that I get from a mass. So just continuing to try to look for that balance.
Steph, I know that there's, fewer discrepancies between what you believe and what Judaism believes, but has there ever been a time or a conversation or something that you've had to navigate with Judaism and abortion? Or it sounds like you continue to like push the communities that you're in maybe on that. So I would love to hear more about that as well.
Yeah, absolutely. We get the Holocaust thrown around a lot, which is really awful. I'm sure folks here are familiar with antis who show up to clinics and invoke the Holocaust as a way to say like abortion is our modern day Holocaust and all this really horrible anti-Semitic stuff. But there are Jews who do believe that too. There are absolutely people in Judaism who think that the way that we approach abortion nowadays is akin to a Holocaust, right? That we've, really, really hard, ugly things. I think overall, the Jewish community, at least in America, is in a place much further along than like the Catholic Church, where we can have rabbis who are talking about abortion from the Bima, right? Who can talk about abortion access and refer their congregants to abortion clinics and provide pro-abortion spiritual counseling. And there are definitely Jews who don't feel that way. Jews are overall, again, very liberal in this country and pro-choice, but there was a Jewish rally for abortion justice this summer that I spoke at that was protested by ultra-Orthodox Jews who came and really feel that, and like, I hate to say it, like parts of them aren't wrong. Like parts of what they say, like half of all Jews were wiped off the face of the earth in the Holocaust. Like that is truth. And we aren't even back to, pre-Holocaust numbers of Jews nowadays, which is something to consider, right? But, I always think about Gisela Pearl, who was an she called herself the abortionist of Auschwitz, who chose to provide abortions for patients so they wouldn't have to be experimented on in Auschwitz by Mengele. And she said, like, it felt like I was destroying life. Like it felt like I was destroying Jewish children. But it's what I had to do in order to protect these women and these people in front of me, and spare them the horrors that we were all experiencing. And not that everyday situations, like I think anyone can have an abortion for whatever reason they need. And I think there's something really remarkable there to say, like, abortions are necessary. There are necessary reasons and necessary justifications to have an abortion. And those are Jewish reasons, and those are Jewish enough. Those are embedded with Jewish values and Jewish intention. And it's funny, like I was talking about this with someone earlier, actually, about the conservatives who come into clinics, right, to have their abortions, right? Conservatives need abortions too. Republicans have abortions too. And what we struggle with is the hypocrisy there, right? Like of them saying that their abortion is the only justified one, that they have the only just good justification, the only right reason to have an abortion is their own abortion, or their daughter's abortion or something like that. And it's the same hypocrisy that you would see in pockets of the Jewish world for people who don't believe in abortion, even though it doesn't need them to believe in it for it to exist and to happen. Their reasons for an abortion, their rabbis, permission is the only correct permission, right? Like it's definitely a multifaceted issue here in the Jewish community, but luckily that is something that I don't have to experience. That if I need an abortion, my rabbis would be totally in support of me and are in support of their congregants who have had abortions and are having abortions. So it's rare to have to encounter that firsthand. And for that, I'm pretty grateful.
I guess I sort of wanted to end here by giving you both the space to say anything else on this topic that McKenna and I may not have thought to ask, because, you know, you both are intimately knowledgeable about your own beliefs and its relation to your well-being, to abortion, etc. So I wanted to make sure to give you both some space at the end to share anything else that you feel like we haven't asked or that you want to make sure our listeners know or understand.
Yeah, I think something that I've been thinking about throughout this conversation is going back to this like faith and religion and abortion, kind of like combining all these questions. I was in an abortion doula training put on by the Bay Area Doula Project for the past 2 days. And today, one of the incredible abortion doulas who was speaking was talking about during her abortion, when she was preparing for that, her spiritual practice was to meditate and speak to both her ancestors and the spirit of, you know, what she called the baby of the child, leading up to this abortion, and forming that spiritual bond, and making sure that, you know, again, using her language here, the spirit of the child knew that it just wasn't the right time, and making sure that it was, you know, understood that. And that was something I have never once had, I've never heard anyone talk about like abortion in that way before, ever. And I feel like I've been in a lot of abortion conversations and a lot of these abortion doula trainings, and it just so made me stop and think. And like, I've been reeling about it all day. Like, this happened 6 hours ago. It's all I've been able to think about, because what a beautiful spiritual practice when it comes to abortion. And I can't stop thinking about how can I take my spirituality or my patient spirituality, and if it's wanted, bring it into this procedure, bring it into this conversation, into the doula work. And I don't have an answer to that, because that's why I've been reeling for like 6 hours. But it really was just so beautiful and so powerful to me. And it affirmed, even though this doula does not practice a religion, and this was very much her own spiritual practices, like, it affirmed to me that it is not just, you know, okay, but like, abortion is sacred, it is spiritual, it can be spiritual, rather, it is sacred, it can be spiritual, and like, that's okay, that's normal, that's good, like, you do what you got to do. And it's just amazing the different ways that like we as humans can approach this thing that's been happening for all of time, and will continue to happen for all of time, and combining it with our own religious and spiritual practices. I don't really have a question here. It's just something that I can't stop thinking about, and it was kind of related.
Wow, that you just answered a question that I have had for a long time, actually, because that was so beautiful. Like, I just got goosebumps. I was interviewing the director of the Red River Women's Clinic for an article years ago at this point, and she was telling me, completely unrelated to the article, but I wound up spending like half my time asking questions about this program. They have this program called Plants for Patients, and it was this completely like volunteer run, created. An art student did her like thesis or something with ceramics and created these pots and fired these little pots for plants, but would also paint them and decorate them and make them beautiful, and then put soil in them, and then put an actual plant in them. And then every patient who has an abortion in their clinic has the opportunity to take a plant home and grow and nurture and cultivate this plant if they want. And like, first of all, I was like, excuse me while I go weep, and also figure out how I can do this. And it's really logistically hard. It's very hard to do, but for like 11 years, it has been this like beautiful love letter from the community to these patients. And I haven't been able to nail why that touches me so deeply, but I think what you just said feels so right to me, that like it's this soul, the spiritual, soulful moment that can be really sacred. And I think like, I have cats, I'm never gonna have children, but I have plants, right? Like there's something so important about giving that energy, right, and attention to that energy. And I think you just said that so perfectly, that that's exactly why I think like this, that these plants like is such a beautiful and touching gesture. So, because it's sacred, because it's holy, like that feels, oh, I have chills. That was so beautiful. Thank you for sharing that, Emily. Yeah, and so to answer, what, sorry, remind me the question again. I was like so absorbed into what Emily was saying.
Oh, it was just whatever you wanted people to know that maybe I haven't asked about yet, or that you want to create, you want to make sure our listeners know.
Yes. For me, the biggest thing is that I am pro-abortion, not in spite of my religion, but because of it. Very, very clearly in my texts, in my communities, in my values, and all of the things I learned from Judaism, all of those things point me to be pro-abortion. But not only pro-abortion, an abortion activist. This is what I do, right? I do practical support. I was an escort for a long time. I do abortion funding. I do all sorts of pro-abortion work because I'm a Jew, not in spite of it. And those moments are holy and sacred moments for me. I wrote about why I used to spend Saturday mornings outside of an abortion clinic escorting, and why that was literally praying with my feet. So there are times when when I'm like on Yom Kippur, one of the holiest holidays of the year, I'll spend that outside of the Supreme Court, right, protesting. So it's really critical to make that known, that you absolutely can be religious and pro-choice, not in spite of it, your religion, but because of it. My Judaism informs every aspect of my life, which includes my feminism, and it includes my politics, it includes my beliefs around abortion. And I feel really strongly that those two things are not mutually exclusive.
I'm going to cut in here and jump back really fast to Emily's
I knew
comment.
you were McKenna. McKenna's been saying this for so long. Anyway, okay, go ahead.
I didn't share this in my introduction, but I want to solidify that is the exact experience I've had when I've brought through souls in readings who have who their parent has chosen to have an abortion or needed to have an abortion. That is exactly what has been communicated with me by numerous souls. And that, my work in that realm of my life, like mediumship and readings, has given me such a broader view and solidified my beliefs on abortion and gender and so many, amazing things. And so I just want to reiterate that, like, the story that you shared, it's really beautiful. And I think it's an aspect of spirituality or religion that is really spoken about because it's hard. It is heavy. And I do want to share, though, that when I connect to the souls of those children, or just souls, I mean, energy, they have never once shared anything that is like any resentment or any fear or anything of that sort. Every single time it has been extreme compassion, understanding of the circumstances involved, and just like the most beautiful interaction and relationship that I've experienced in mediumship work. Honestly, like, there is no other connection I feel in that work. And so I just want to say that that's like a really powerful example and something that I've experienced as well.
That is so affirming to hear. Thank you for sharing that. That's really, like I said, I've already been thinking about this other thing for like all day, and that's just going to continue this. That is so powerful.
Yeah, it really is. And especially even like, I don't know. It's just our human brains and the messaging and the fear and all of those things that are thrown our way are purely to distract us from the nature of an energetic relationship at whatever level. And I don't know. It has been like, I find that part of my work and being able to have those experiences. The first time it happened, I very much shied away from communicating in that way, in a very explicit way with the person that I was reading, mostly because it was in a group setting and I wanted to, be very respectful. And I knew that that person, when I communicated what kind of soul was kind of presenting themselves, they would understand the nature of that. And even especially, people who have gone on to have other children who are different souls, there's nothing but a celebratory nature from the soul that originally came through. And so I
Wow.
really would like to share more about that. I feel like it's a conversation that's missing, because I think that people in the spirituality space are scared to have that, I don't know, direct kind of conversation. And it's much easier to kind of talk about on the other side of like spirit babies and those other things, which I do think we can connect to children that you may or may not bring into the physical world. And then I also have had situations where the soul has communicated, even in like fertility kind of situations or in kind of an active choice, they have communicated like, I'm going to kind of stick around in this orbit, and that soul could be connected to a further pregnancy, not always. And then lastly, the last thing I'll share on this is I've also connected with people who have had abortions or have had miscarriages, obviously very different things, where there has not been a soul connected to the biological pregnancy. And so that all those things are very, very powerful and have informed kind of my personal opinion as well. That was a
Wow.
bit of a ramble, so I'm sorry for that. But
No,
yeah.
no, thank you for sharing that. That's really touching and beautiful. I've never heard anyone talk about anything like you just did. So that's really, I have like so much to also chew on tonight. Wow.
We're all gonna get off the pod and like just scribble all these notes.
Do some journaling. Yeah.
Yeah. And I think it's important too to say, there's so much in these spaces that I feel are people, even when you hear me speak, it's like, if something that I say doesn't land within your body, screw it, right? Like there's so many people that present themselves as experts in kind of what you should fully believe. And I think that this is another, there's no difference here in this conversation.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
I love it. Any final thoughts, Emily, Steph, before we close?
Also, where can we find you guys?
Oh yeah. Okay. Actually, let's do that. So Steph and Emily, just give your final pitches for where people can find you, where they should read your latest stuff, etc.
You go first, Emily.
You can find all my stuff at emmyfrommini.com. That's EMMYFROMMINNY.com. That's also my handle on Instagram and Twitter, which I am both pretty active on. So you'll find my newsletter if you want to have me do any self-care Reiki things, like all of it, Emmy from Minnie.
We'll also put this all in the description too. So you can also just scroll down a tiny bit on your screen. Perfect.
I am at Steph Reflects, STEPHREFLECTS.
Yes, you got it.
Yep. There's a reason why I like working with editors so much.
Yeah.
I'm horrible at spelling. So I'm Steph Reflects on all platforms. You can find me like LinkedIn, TikTok, Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, all of the above. My website is stephblackstrategies.com. And that's also where you can sign up for my newsletter, The Reaper Queen of DC, which is now twice a month, moving up in the world, went from a monthly to a twice a month system. So that's where you can find all my readings, my writings, press, what I've been up to, all the activism that I do. And I'm very reachable and very open to being reached out to. So anyone can email, DM, send a homing pigeon, whatever it may be. I'm open.
We love that. Maybe an owl.
An owl. Send me an owl. It'd be the coolest thing ever. My cats would freak out. So keep that in mind.
Also, I just love the newsletter name. That's such a vibe
Yeah.
and I love it.
I had a lot of imposter syndrome with it. I was like, am I like calling myself a queen? And then I was like, yeah, and I'm cool with that actually. So.
No, I am.
Yes.
I love that. Well, again, I mean, I assume I speak for McKenna here when I say we are so grateful you both took time out of your day to talk about this. I'm so excited for people to listen. And I think it added so much nuance to this month and conversations about abortion and religion and faith. And I feel very lucky that you both were here and able to share your insights.
Yeah. Thank you for having me. And this was, like, Emily, you're somebody who I've also been an admirer of for a long time. So it's so cool that we got to be on this together and I got to actually like hear you talk in first person. So this was wonderful. And anytime you need anything Jewish, abortion, DC, what have you, I'm open and around. I love doing this kind of stuff. So it was really great to meet you both and to be here participating in this.
Thank you so much. This was such a good conversation. Literally, I already know every journal entry for the next week is going to be about this. It's so powerful, so beautiful. Ugh, just very grateful.
I just want to share as well that these conversations don't happen in just this bubble. So I think it's important if you are listening and you have new thoughts that you need to bounce off of somebody, we're all available. Hopefully that's okay to say, to have kind of these conversations, because it can feel lonely if you are just kind of trying to process on your own. So yeah, Emily, Steph, thank you so much. Also, side note, they both have amazing glasses, which I admire so much. I wish I was a cool girl with cool glasses.
That's like the perfect note to end on. Thank you for that.
All right, I'm gonna stop the recording.